Good morning. Welcome to the Sunday Morning Marxist Forum, a project of the Institute for Critical Study of Society, that is ICSS, founded in Oakland in 2004 to preserve Marx's heritage and to support struggles for social justice and struggle for socialism leading to communism one day. The opinions expressed in our forum are only those of its authors, but we all are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, who in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach said, "The philosophers have interpreted the world in different ways. The point, however, is to change it." We are living today with two major violent conflicts, one in Ukraine and the other in Palestine. The US as a unipolar power is seriously challenged. Putin is now, as Stalin was during Cold War, a target of organized imperialist propaganda. Stalin, the savior of us all, the whole world, I think, including the Jews in World War II, was accused of anti-Semitism by Zionist and Trotsky's followers. Today, defense of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza is being defended by Israel supporters who accuse critics of Israel of anti-Semitism. Our speaker today is researcher, historian, author, and teacher, Professor Grover Furr of Montclair State University in New Jersey. His talk today is on his research for his newly published book titled Trotsky's Comintern Conspiracy, the case of Osip Pyatnitsky, which he co-authored with Vladimir Bobrov. Like his numerous previous books on the Stalin-era history of the USSR, this book is also based on his and their decades-long research using declassified material in Russia. Stalin died in 1953, then came Khrushchev's revisionism and his so-called secret speech that Professor Furr exposed in his 2011 book titled Khrushchev Lied, and many other books following it. His books have been translated into multiple languages, at least 4 in India alone by now. Please join me in welcoming Professor Grover Furr.
Thank you very much. On my screen, I and the other people in the top row are all squeezed up, so you can only see part of our face. Is that the case with others? Can you see?
Well, I think there is a tab there which says you are being recorded. So if you say okay there, then you will see full faces.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, sure. There you go. And also, I keep getting these messages that say there are people in the waiting room.
Alan is on top of that.
Alan's on top of that. Okay, because there are people who are asking to be admitted. Okay, so I won't bother with that. All right.
Yeah.
So we're up to 82 now. That's not too bad.
That's the largest gathering we ever had for any speaker in our forum in the last 17, 18 years.
All righty. Okay. Okay, well, let me get started. I want to make sure that my audio is good. Okay, this is a laptop and everybody can hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to read my speech, which means I'm going to be casting my eyes down because I don't have a teleprompter or anything like that. So I have to look down at what I've written. I have found that it's much better if I write everything out. This is the 5th draft of my talk today. It's better organized. I think it's more understandable. But the downside is you don't see my eyes. I'm looking down instead of looking at you. I hope you forgive that. Okay. I'd like to thank the ICSS organizers for inviting me to talk about my and Vladimir L. Bobrov's latest book, Trotsky's Comintern Conspiracy, the case of Osip Pyatnitsky. First, I would like to give some context that will help to explain its importance. The academic field of Soviet history is corrupt. It exists primarily to spread anti-communist lies, and especially anti-Stalin lies, while giving those lies an appearance of respectability. Good research on specific topics does take place, but the results of that research are always fitted into an anti-Stalin framework. I have published 2 full-length studies of influential books that do nothing but pass on anti-Stalin falsehoods as the truth. Blood Lies in 2014, and Stalin Waiting for the Truth in 2019. All Trotskyite writing, including what they call research on the Stalin period of the Soviet history, is likewise completely corrupt. Trotskyites are a true cult, like the cult around Jesus Christ. They accept all of Trotsky's lies as the truth. Trotskyism is parasitical on mainstream anti-communist falsehood, which they repeat uncritically. I have discussed this in much detail in 4 of my books. Since Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25, 1956, allegations of crimes against Joseph Stalin, without any evidence at all, have dominated academic historiography. I began to discover this almost 50 years ago, when I decided to check the accusations against Stalin in Robert Conquest's famous book, The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s. During the mid-1970s, I went many times to the New York Public Library, where I checked all the footnotes in Conquest's book. I discovered that Conquest had no evidence at all to support the accusations he made against Stalin. Conquest merely cited other books that made the same accusations. In 1999, Vladimir L. Bobrov, a Moscow-based historian, contacted me about an article of mine on my webpage. From Vladimir, I learned that since the end of the Soviet Union, a great many documents were being released from formerly closed Soviet archives. With his help, I began to locate, obtain, and study them. I soon realized that they included primary source evidence that disproved many allegations against Stalin. Between 2005 and 2007, I researched and wrote Khrushchev Lied. In it, I showed that all the accusations of crimes that Khrushchev made in that secret speech against Stalin and against Lavrentiy Beria are false. Expertly translated into Russian by Vladimir, Khrushchev Lied was published in Moscow in December 2007 and in English in February 2011. Since then, I have written more than a dozen books in which I examine accusations against Stalin in the light of primary source evidence from former Soviet archives. In more than 20 years of study, I have yet to identify a single accusation of a crime by Stalin that can be supported by evidence. Documents from former Soviet archives continue to be published. One recent example is a letter from Ivan N. Smirnov to his daughter Olga after Smirnov's appeal of the death sentence passed on him in the August 1937 Moscow trial. Smirnov was the leader of the Trotskyite underground in the Soviet Union. He is still considered a martyr by Trotskyites and anti-communists. Smirnov wrote his daughter the following, quote, "In my last word, I say this to all the wavering Trotskyites. We must disarm decisively and quickly. Keep in mind that the Gestapo men who figured in the trial were not front men, but real clever fascists. Whether Trotsky wants it or not, his periphery has become intertwined with the Gestapo." End quote. Here, Smirnov tells his daughter that he was not framed by Stalin and that Trotsky's movement was connected with the Nazi Gestapo, something that all anti-communists, and of course all Trotskyites, have always denied. We began Trotsky's Comintern conspiracy by studying the claim of Osip Pyatnitsky's son Vladimir that his father was framed by Stalin for opposing him. We demonstrate with evidence that this is completely false. Pyatnitsky was not framed. He was guilty, just as guilty as Trotsky was himself. In the first chapters, we critically examine the account of Pyatnitsky's fate by historian Boris Starkov. We prove that it is entirely fraudulent. This is significant because Starkov's account was published in 1994 in the journal Europe-Asia Studies, the foremost Soviet history journal in the world. This prestigious journal should have seen that Starkov's article was a fraud, but they were either blinded by their anti-Stalin bias, or perhaps they did see it and published it anyway. We studied the Comintern conspiracy, in which Pyatnitsky played a leading role within the Soviet Union, in collusion with Leon Trotsky, who headed the conspiracy from exile. The conspirators plotted assassinations of Soviet leaders, sabotage of the Soviet economy, an uprising against the government in the event of invasion by a fascist power, diversion of Comintern funds to Trotsky, and collaboration with and espionage for Nazi Germany. We examine evidence from the NKVD investigation files of a number of Comintern leaders, including Bela Kun, Lajos Magyar, Wilhelm Knorren, Heinz Neumann, Nikolai Bukharin, and Pyatnitsky himself. The final chapters translate and examine the indictment, trial, death sentence, and phony rehabilitation of Pyatnitsky by Khrushchev's men. Our book concludes with a translation into English of all of Pyatnitsky's confession statements. Our evidence is based on documents painstakingly copied by Vladimir from the formerly secret NKVD archive in Moscow. That evidence refutes the claim that Osip Pyatnitsky challenged Stalin at the June 1937 Central Committee plenum. We expose as fraudulent the Khrushchev-era rehabilitation of Pyatnitsky, one of the many rehabilitation reports on persons convicted during the 1930s. These convictions are still routinely said to be the result of Stalin's paranoia or brutality. We show that this is completely false. We refute the allegation, virtually unanimous among historians, that the Soviet Party, that is Stalin, controlled the Comintern. We discuss some of the voluminous evidence that Leon Trotsky and his clandestine followers inside the Soviet Union collaborated with the Nazis, sabotaged the economy, and plotted to assassinate Soviet leaders. In their 1999 source book on the Bolshevik Party during the 1930s, Arch Getty and Oleg V. Naumov wrote the following, quote, "There apparently was little difference between the Stalinist leaders' private thoughts and their public positions. They seem really to have believed in the existence of a far-flung conspiracy." End quote. In 1999, it was almost unheard of for a scholar in the field of Soviet history to state that Stalin, far from framing innocent persons, sincerely believed that the conspiracies were genuine. But Getty did not take the next logical step. He did not ask, what is the evidence concerning the alleged conspiracy? Is there any evidence that it was fictitious, an invention perhaps of Nikolai Yezhov and his minions in the NKVD? Or is there evidence that the conspiracy was genuine and that those convicted of participating in it were guilty? A dozen years later, V.N. Khaustov, another mainstream anti-communist historian of the Stalin period, concluded that Stalin believed the reports the NKVD sent to him. Quote, "The most frightening thing was that Stalin made his decisions on the basis of confessions that were the result of the inventions of certain employees of the organs of state security. Stalin's reaction to these confessions is testimony that he took these confessions completely seriously." End quote. Like Getty and Naumov in 1999, Khaustov concludes that Stalin believed the information about the conspiracies given to him by Yezhov, who was head, that is to say, Commissar of the NKVD. They all agree that Stalin did not frame anyone. But Khaustov, too, was unwilling to admit even the possibility that the conspiracy was real. Why? Because accepting the possibility that the conspiracies were genuine would dismantle the historiography of the Stalin period that has been constructed since Khrushchev, and in fact since Trotsky's writings of the 1930s. It would undermine the false depiction of Stalin as a murderous dictator who killed thousands of loyal communists. It would contradict the works of generations of historians who had embraced the Khrushchev, Gorbachev, Trotsky version of Stalin and Soviet history. I call this phenomenon the anti-Stalin paradigm. In the professional study of Soviet history, there is an unwritten rule that Stalin must be assumed to be guilty of many murders and other crimes. Moreover, once Stalin has been accused of a crime, it is considered in poor taste, if not actually taboo, to investigate the evidence and conclude that Stalin was not, in fact, guilty. Stalin's guilt is assumed in advance, despite the lack of evidence. Any historian who dares to conclude that real conspiracies did exist, that Stalin and the Soviet leadership were dealing with genuine mortal threats to the Soviet state, will simply not be published in mainstream historical journals or by academically respectable publishers. And then that historian would lose his job because publication is essential to tenure and promotion. The truth, which is obvious to anyone who studies the primary sources in a spirit of objectivity, is that these serious conspiracies were real. There is an enormous amount of evidence from former Soviet archives to prove it. We have studied and analyzed much of this evidence in previous books. In 1955, Pyatnitsky was declared rehabilitated, the victim of a Stalin frame-up. Soon afterwards, the right Trotskyite conspiracy within the Comintern was declared to be a fabrication. Since then, all those convicted in all three Moscow trials have been rehabilitated. In our book, we examined the 1955 rehabilitation report on Pyatnitsky and the concept of rehabilitation itself. We note that all of the Khrushchev era and Gorbachev era rehabilitations of persons convicted of participation in anti-Soviet conspiracies, all that is to which we have access today, are fraudulent. None of them contain any evidence that the convicted person was, in fact, innocent. We present the text of some of these reports sent to Stalin that include reference to Pyatnitsky. As Getty and Naumov and Kaustov agree, Stalin accepted these reports as genuine. Stalin believed that he was taking decisive action against anti-Soviet conspiracies that did indeed pose a serious security threat to the Soviet Union. The evidence available to us today proves that Stalin was correct. Many people, including historians who should know better, assume that confessions are dubious or even invalid as evidence because they might have been obtained by violence or threats against either the prisoner or his relatives. Such people dismiss the evidence contained in confessions. Their reasoning goes something like this, and here is their reasoning, not mine. As there is often no material evidence, for example, documents where the conspirators outlined their conspiracy, perhaps even in the handwriting of the conspirators themselves, found in their homes, containing their signatures, etc. This means that there is no evidence against the accused except for confessions by the accused or accusations in the confessions of other prisoners. But confessions can be faked, and we know that many confessions were faked by the NKVD. Consequently, the accused must be considered innocent and the trial a farce. Okay? Indeed, anti-communists frequently use the word farce in order to dismiss, for example, the three Moscow trials of 1936, 1937, and 1938. Those who use the word farce are evidently unaware that they are thereby admitting, perhaps unconsciously, that they have no evidence that the trials were fabrications. They just assume they were. This reasoning is, of course, faulty. All evidence documents, material objects such as books and photographs, testimony of any kind, can be faked. It is at least as difficult, perhaps even more difficult, to convince experienced revolutionaries to falsely confess than it is to fabricate false documents complete with forged handwriting and signatures, or to create phony photographs. Any modern state in the 1930s as well as today, possesses the technical means to create any kind of fake evidence that can be exposed as fake, if at all, only by destructive means of examination, which is never permitted. Confessions are no more or less subject to fakery than any other kind of evidence. What the historian must do in the case of confessions, as with any kind of evidence, is to study it carefully and compare it to the other evidence that exists, in order to search for similarities and differences, contradictions and consistencies. The Soviet prosecution did provide material evidence at the second and third Moscow trials, but anti-communists and Trotskyites simply ignore it. They know that very few people will read the 600 and 800-page transcripts of these trials and discover that, yes, in fact, there was indeed material evidence against the defendants. So, how can we tell if a defendant was falsely convicted? The answer is, we need to locate and study the evidence that the Soviet prosecution had at the defendant's trial. We, Vladimir and I, have obtained and studied many Khrushchev-era and Gorbachev-era rehabilitation reports. We have never found even one that provided evidence. Yet they are taken as proof of innocence by anti-communists and by Trotskyites. When it comes to historical evidence, there is no such thing as credibility. All evidence must be subjected to doubt and carefully studied. Everyone has biases, but everybody can learn to be objective in studying any subject, whether it be physics or history. The techniques are basically similar. Objectivity as a scientific method is a practice of distrust of the self. You can learn to be objective by training yourself to become aware of, to articulate, and then to question your own preconceived ideas. You must be reflexively suspicious of evidence that tends to confirm your own preconceived ideas, prejudices, and preferences. You must learn to give an especially generous reading to any evidence and arguments that contradict your own preconceived ideas. This is simply what every bourgeois detective in every detective story knows. As Sherlock Holmes says in A Study in Scarlet, quote, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases the judgment." End quote. In other words, get the facts before you form your hypothesis. Be ready to abandon a hypothesis that does not explain the established facts, especially if that hypothesis conforms to a preconceived idea of your own. If you do not begin your research with a determined attempt to be objective, accompanied by definite strategies to minimize your own biases, then you cannot and will not discover the truth. To put the matter bluntly, if you don't start out to look for the truth, you will not stumble across it by accident, and what you do find will not be the truth. This principle is well known. Therefore, the real purpose of most research into Soviet history is not to discover the truth. Instead, it is to prefer convenient falsehoods to uncomfortable facts, to arrive at politically acceptable conclusions, and to disregard the evidence when that evidence does not align with those politically acceptable conclusions. Why is this logical fallacy so common in Soviet history of the Stalin period? I believe this is due to the power of the anti-Stalin paradigm. Stalin has been so maligned by so many experts and for so long a time that many people believe where there's smoke, there's fire. There must be something to this. This is all wrong. There is no substitute for evidence. In our books, we examine the evidence and draw conclusions from the evidence alone. This is the only rationally defensible way of proceeding. In history, as in any other field of scientific investigation. In one section of our book, we examine the issue of torture and the historical problems related to it. Time does not permit me to outline it here and now. However, we did study the case of A.I. Langfang, the investigator and interrogator in Pyatnitsky's case. In a brilliant analysis in our book, Vladimir shows that Langfang was not one of Nikolai Yezhov's torturers and confession fakers. Read these passages and let me know what you think. During Khrushchev's time, 1953 to 64, and Gorbachev's time, 1985 to 91, the Soviet state devoted a lot of resources to criminalizing Stalin. The rehabilitation documents that have been published make this clear. It is hard to imagine that any genuine evidence tending to show Stalin guilty of framing innocent persons would have been ignored, but they never found any such evidence. Conversely, we may suspect that a good deal of the material that has not been released from the former Soviet archives tends to cast doubt on the official anti-Stalin version. And in fact, documents have been released here and there that do tend to exculpate Stalin. An example is the 2018 declassification of the transcript of the June 11, 1937 trial of the military conspirators known as the Tukhachevsky affair. This transcript has always been in the Soviet archives. So all the phony communist misleaders of the Soviet Union from Khrushchev on have known that Tukhachevsky and the rest were guilty as hell of conspiring with Hitler's army, plotting to overthrow the Soviet government, to murder Stalin and other leaders, and to open the front to any fascist invaders. Nevertheless, all Soviet leaders from Khrushchev on said that Stalin had framed Tukhachevsky and the rest. In January 2021, Vladimir and I, together with our Swedish colleague Sven Erik Holmström, published a book about the Tukhachevsky affair. There is so much primary source evidence of their guilt that we could not include all of it, but we include a great deal of it. In our book, Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy, we also print an English translation of the full text, 172 pages long in Russian, of the trial transcript. This is the only translation into any language. Sometimes documents are released several times, the later versions contradicting the earlier versions, so that it is clear that phony primary documents are being fabricated until a final forged version is declared official by its being inserted into an archive. This is clearly the case with the forged documents that Stalin ordered Jewish theater director Solomon Mikhoels to be murdered, and those that supposedly prove Soviet guilt in the Katyn massacre of Polish prisoners of war. We have published books about both of these anti-communist and anti-Stalin falsifications. Stalin Exonerated, Fact-Checking the Death of Solomon Mikhoels in 2023, and The Mystery of the Katyn Massacre, The Evidence, the Solution in 2018. As always in the writing of history, our conclusions must be provisional. Historians do not deal in certainties. As more evidence comes to light in future, we must be prepared to adjust or even discard our earlier conclusions. It bears repeating that we have to be prepared to question our own preconceived ideas and historical paradigms. It's not easy to do this, but if we don't keep the need to do it in the forefront of our consciousness, we will inevitably fall prey to confirmation bias, looking with favor on evidence that tends to support our own preconceived ideas, while looking critically only at evidence that tends to disprove those same preconceived ideas. This is what mainstream anti-communists and Trotskyists do all the time. Heinz Neumann had been a leading figure in the Communist Party of Germany. He was convicted of participating in the right Trotskyite conspiracy in the Comintern, tried, and shot on September 26, 1937. Heinz Neumann has long been believed innocent, largely due to the writings of his wife, Margarete Buber-Neumann, a former communist who became a professional anti-communist after World War II. Even in Buber Neumann's memoir, Under Two Dictators, we can find indications that Neumann had suspicious connections. For example, at the time of his arrest, he advised his wife to get out of the Soviet Union and contact Friedrich Adler, a socialist leader famous for his anti-Soviet activity since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Judging by the evidence we now have, Neumann was far from innocent. He was a central figure among the German communists in the secret right Trotskyite opposition. Neumann names Pyatnitsky dozens of times in his interrogations and in a long statement of November 1st, 1937. These passages also serve to clarify Neumann's own activity in the right Trotskyite conspiracy within the Comintern. In our book, we review the most important of those passages. In his confession statements, Pyatnitsky claimed he received orders from Trotsky through third parties. Pyatnitsky was fully aware that Trotsky was negotiating with fascist Germany and militarist Japan to foster an uprising against the Soviet government. Pyatnitsky knew that the conspiracy's aim was to restore capitalist relations in the Soviet Union. Pyatnitsky's main role in the conspiracy was to cultivate his contacts in the Comintern while preparing for the overthrow of the Soviet government by the opposition. Trotsky's contacts with the Germans were essential for this purpose. The oppositionists had lost whatever hope they once had to oust the Stalin leadership by themselves. Trotsky relied on Pyatnitsky to help steal money from the Comintern's budget to send to Trotsky. This amounted to 20,000 gold rubles, about $15,000 American a year for 3 years. This money was supposed to go to support revolutionaries all over the world. But Pyatnitsky and company sent it to Trotsky to fund his collaboration with the Nazis and fascists and his sabotage against the Red Army and the Soviet economy. Pyatnitsky pled guilty at his trial. Now, Soviet law had a provision somewhat like the Fifth Amendment. At trial, a defendant could refuse to confirm his pretrial testimony, including any confessions of guilt he had made during the investigation. In such cases, the prosecution would have to rely on other evidence. Rehabilitation documents of the Khrushchev era and later state that some defendants did refuse to confirm their confessions at trial. Nikolai Yezhov himself, who was unquestionably responsible for many tens of thousands of deaths of innocent persons, did this. So a defendant could refuse to confirm his own confessions, but he couldn't do anything about the testimony of others against him. In the case of Yezhov, whose investigation file and trial transcript have not been declassified yet, his former second-in-command, Mikhail Frenovsky, was available to testify against him. There was certainly a great deal of other testimony against Yezhov as well. In the case of a conspiracy in which there was no material, for example, documentary evidence, this would mean the testimony of witnesses against the defendant. The indictment against Pyatnitsky lists the names of 13 men who gave testimony against Pyatnitsky. The indictment states there were, quote, a number of others. The testimony of so many co-conspirators constitutes a large body of evidence against Pyatnitsky. Any attempt to refute it at trial would have been futile. Denial was futile too. There was simply too much evidence against him. In his last words at his own trial on March 13, 1938, Nikolai Bukharin said, quote, I shall now speak of myself, of the reasons for my repentance. Of course, it must be admitted that incriminating evidence plays a very important part. The point, of course, is not this repentance, or my personal repentance in particular. The court can pass its verdict without it. The confession of the accused is not essential. Bukharin was correct. There was an enormous number of accusations against Bukharin by others in the right Trotskyite conspiracy. Bukharin wrote 2 eloquent appeals of his death sentence. They have been published. In them, he agrees that for his crimes, he, quote, should be shot 10 times over. Pyatnitsky made his own appeal for mercy at his trial. Our account of the opposition conspiracies is strongly supported by the evidence that has become available since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. However, despite the evidence, it is mostly or totally rejected by mainstream scholarship. The field of Soviet history has been dominated by lies about Stalin since Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union after Joseph Stalin's death on March 5, 1953. Khrushchev soon began a campaign to attack Stalin by accusing him of ruthlessly killing party leaders during the 1930s and 40s. Khrushchev's campaign increased in intensity after the 22nd Party Congress in October 1961. Khrushchev led the Soviet Union until he was ousted by the Central Committee in October 1964. During the eras of Leonid Brezhnev, 64 to 82, Yuri Andropov, 82 to 84, and Konstantin Chernenko, 84 to 85, attacks against Stalin almost entirely ceased, although the Khrushchev-era lies about Stalin were not retracted. A short time after his elevation to the leadership of the party in March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev began a campaign of historical falsification and vilification of Stalin that was, if anything, more virulent than that of Khrushchev. The Khrushchev era and Gorbachev era falsifications against Stalin were manna from heaven for pro-capitalist anti-communists and for the Trotskyite movement. During these periods, Soviet historians could not cite evidence to prove their assaults on Stalin. The Soviet archives of the Stalin period were closed even to the most trusted researchers, party historians. Nevertheless, these falsehoods were accepted as truthful. After the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian authorities began to publish documents from former Soviet archives. Today, we have mountains of such documents about virtually every area of Soviet life during the 1920s and 30s. We have been identifying, locating, studying, and drawing conclusions from this flood of documents. They permit us to see that every single accusation of crime, atrocity, or even minor misdeed attributed to Stalin since Khrushchev's day is false. Vladimir Bobrov and I have been searching for 25 years for any evidence of any crime by Stalin. There simply is no such evidence. Nonetheless, these lies about Stalin himself and Soviet history of the Stalin era continue to dominate historical discourse. Since its inception around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, the academic field of Soviet history has mainly served the purpose of anti-communist propaganda. It has only secondarily been concerned with discovering the truth about Soviet history. Within the world communist movement itself, Khrushchev's secret speech and the anti-Stalin allegations that followed it had to be accepted by all those who wished to remain in their communist parties. The Trotskyite movement, weak and in decline, was given a transfusion of life by Khrushchev's lies. The result is that since Khrushchev's time, the demonization of Stalin has dominated not only academic Soviet history, but also the view of Soviet history held by communists the world over for almost 70 years. This false demonized portrait of Stalin and of Soviet history during his time has grown deep roots in every aspect of historical thinking, from academic studies to popular and semi-popular books and articles, to textbooks in colleges and high schools, to the mass media. Some communists joined with the Chinese and Albanian parties in breaking with the Moscow-oriented movement and rejecting the anti-Stalin tendency. But no one had evidence to support their suspicions that Khrushchev and later Gorbachev were lying about Stalin. Today, we do have such evidence. What about the future? The process of uprooting the lies about Stalin and the Stalin-era Soviet Union will take years. It is in the interest of anti-communists and Trotskyites to continue to promote those lies. Trotskyites and anti-communists simply do not care about the truth, about evidence, or about objectivity in the study of Soviet history. Lies about Stalin are necessary for academic careers and for anti-communist, pro-capitalist, and Trotskyite propaganda. In contrast, we, Vladimir, Sven Eric, and myself, are dedicated to discovering the truth about Stalin and the Stalin period of Soviet history by studying the evidence with thoroughness and objectivity. We realize that those to whom the truth is a threat will call us Stalinists and tell themselves and others that they should ignore our research. We are, of course, not Stalinists. But there are a great many people in all countries who are hungry for the truth about the successes and failures of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period. They welcome the results of our research, and we welcome their comments and criticisms. Thank you very much. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Grover. So what we're going to do now, make some announcements, and then go into question and comment period. So I wanted to let you know what's coming up next week. Next week, we're going to have the subject next week, sorry, is the increasing repression of and resistance by the Palestine Liberation and Solidarity Movement. The speaker is Charlotte Cates. That'll be October 27, 10:30 a.m., same time. So we hope you'll join us. So now what I'm going to do is set the rules for our question comment session. First of all, please, you raise your hands, and you know how to do it. If you don't, there is a in my case, in my screen, there is a reactions. There is something called more with three dots, and then you go there. It says reactions, and reactions. You can raise hands. Okay. Once you hit the reactions, it'll give you an option. So please raise your hands. I'll try to go sequentially, but if you're not gone, if I don't call on you sequentially, don't worry, I'll catch everybody. Then the other thing is that each person who speaks, you have a limit of 2 minutes. Please try to stay within 2 minutes. We don't like to kind of interrupt you, so please attend to that time yourself, setting up a maybe stopwatch when you're speaking. And then we'll ask Professor Furr to respond to each question one at a time, one speaker and then one response. And we still have quite a bit of time. And if it's early, then Professor Furr has some things to attend to, so we'll let him go. But we can now go. By the way, one more thing is that it takes some money and effort. It takes a lot of effort, but some money also. So please donate to our program, the Sunday morning Marxist Forum. And the way to do it is to go to our website, which is ICSSmarx.org. There, if you haven't, you can also sign up to get announcement for future programs coming up. So that will be convenient for you to know what's coming up. And there you can also see what the past programs were, immediate past programs. Our program is being recorded, and it will be on YouTube later this week. So with that said, I'm going to go to if Professor Furr is ready,
Yep.
then I'll go to the, you ready?
So I just want to go get a copy of our book here.
Okay, very good. Okay.
There it is. There's the book. You can buy it.
Okay, so I will go to the first person. I think Bill Mayer had raised his hand, but I don't see him now. Okay, we have several other people. No, I don't see any raised hands. Um,
I'm back up. I'm up.
Bill's hand is
Okay.
up.
Bill's hands up. Okay, Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I just didn't want to go first, but okay, I'll go. Somebody's got to go first. I just want to first of all thank the ICSS for these stimulating discussions every Sunday. This is something I look forward to. And Grover Furr's book, Khrushchev Lied, sort of changed my life and in my political career. And I really thank him for that, for this solid research and the way he searches for the truth. I use his book quite often to explain the different levels of truth. He's got a chapter on that in that book, and it's very, very rewarding. His work is brave, courageous, and I thank you for it. So I just asked you a couple quick questions. You keep saying anti-communists and Stalinists, anti-communists and Trotskyists. So are you saying that, first question, are you saying that Trotskyists are anti-communists? And then second question is, hasn't anybody in the Soviet Union or now Russia done any research like you're doing? Is there any former Stalinists from the Soviet Union who support you? And how many people are out there supporting your work? You seem like a lone dog out in the middle of nowhere and trying to find the truth by yourself. Who else is supporting you? Thank you.
Okay, shall I answer? Is that how we're going to do it? I'll try to be brief. Okay. Well, thanks for your comments on my work. Okay, so concerning Trotsky, let me just say that Marxists are materialists, which means Marxists determine the truth through the analysis of evidence, as opposed to faith or something like that. Okay, as opposed to religion, let's say. Okay, so evidence is very important. We have a tremendous amount of evidence now to prove that Trotsky collaborated with the Germans and Japanese and was involved in these conspiracies. And the Trotskyites simply ignore it, or they say it's all phony. So to the extent that somebody is a Trotskyite, they are not a Marxist, because they're not acting like a materialist. They're not deciding historical matters on the basis of evidence. And that's why I called it, I called it a cult, because that's the term we reserve for organizations that are based basically on the faith in a leader. And that's what the Trotskyists are. So yeah, despite themselves, in some respects, Trotskyists are anti-communist. In fact, there's a sense in which Trotskyism is more damaging to the left than overt pro-capitalist anti-communists, because Trotskyists import this false anti-communist slanders into the left movement, where they are often very active, very against imperialism and exploitation and so forth, and thereby spread these falsehoods among people who are looking for an anti-capitalist solution, or critical of capitalism and so forth. So I think that's very damaging, and in some respects more damaging, or harmful than the openly overt anti-communist.
Okay, so next one is Polina.
You didn't answer the second part of the question.
What was that?
You're a lone wolf out there. Anybody help?
No. Yeah, well, the short answer is yes. There are a few people around the world, and more than a few people in Russia, working on different topics. So yes, in Russia there are certainly people who are doing this kind of thing, but paradoxically, the United States is actually probably the best place to be if you're going to do research on Soviet history, because during the Cold War, and it continues to today, a number of American research libraries ordered everything that was published in the Soviet Union. They just ordered everything. Probably the government paid for them to do it. I don't know, but you can get those materials. And in my case, in the case of Vladimir and I, well, Vladimir is there to work in the archives. And so, he sees things that I don't see. Sometimes I see things that he doesn't see. So to have one leg in Russia and one leg here, I think is a kind of a unique situation. In that respect, there's nobody else doing exactly what we're doing.
Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to go to the next person, which is Polina Vasiliev.
Thank you. Thank you, Grover, for your excellent presentation. I would like some more background on what the debate was regarding Soviet socialist industrialization in the 20s. My understanding is that part of that network of Trotskyite and rightist conspirators were also the opponents of the industrialization effort. So I'm wondering if you could just comment on that. And also, what's the importance, let's say, for for those folks who live in countries that are working on actually existing socialism, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, how important would it be for this history to inform them? I'm just wondering, whether folks who are in other countries that are working on socialism,
Sure.
What's the value of your work in your opinion, if that makes sense? Thank you.
Sure. The first part of your question was about industrialization or
Yes, and the rightist Trotskyite conspiracy.
Right. Well, there was a
tied.
lot of discussion in the 20s, which I don't want to get into, right, because it's kind of complicated. Well, it's very complicated, and people changed their positions. People in the leadership, the debates in the not only in the party congresses, but also they had party conferences during the 20s. So there was a lot of back and forth. But let me just say this: broadly speaking, there were people who thought that socialism could not be built in one country. That is, a revolution, a socialist revolution, must take place in some advanced capitalist country, which would then turn around and help the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union it had spots of industry, but was mainly a peasant country. Now, this was a position that many people held, and some people held for a time and then abandoned it. You can make a case that Lenin held it for a time, but then abandoned it. So it was most famously, of course, held by Trotsky and his followers. Now, if you're not building socialism in one country, you're building something else. What is that something else? Well, Marxists say either you have socialism or you have communism. You have socialism or you have capitalism. So if you're not building socialism in one country, you have to build some version of capitalism. That made the disagreements very sharp indeed. Okay, and those who held that you couldn't build socialism in one country, who were persuaded either by Trotsky, who was very persuasive and very eloquent, very intelligent, or were persuaded by some other version of that argument, seemed to have really believed that those like Stalin, who wanted to build socialism in one country, were going to ruin the revolution. They were going to ruin Russia. They were going to ruin everything, and they had to be stopped. So it's hard to recreate in words today the degree of feeling on both sides of this debate, because to the people at that time, the future of the world hung on this decision. I think that puts it as strongly as I would care to put it, without going into a lot of detail. And as for the importance, well, let me just use one example. So up until Khrushchev's famous secret speech, China was basically following what you might call the Stalin formula for building socialism. In other words, you conquer power, and then you gradually collectivize agriculture, and then you more rapidly collectivize agriculture, and you industrialize. And here's an important point: you industrialize without foreign capital. Okay, just using the labor of and whatever capital you can amass within the socialist country itself. As a result of Khrushchev's secret speech and the debates that took place afterwards, many people in the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party just abandoned that view. And ultimately, we can see, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of storm and stress, but you can see that immediately after Mao Zedong died in September 1976, the Chinese Communist Party decided to turn away from this idea of industrializing with one's own resources, and they turned away from collectivizing agriculture. And the result you can see today. So I think it's the attack on Stalin had world-shaking repercussions. I am not saying that Stalin had all the answers, that the Soviet Union had all the answers during his time. But certainly after Stalin died, the Soviet policies turned sharply to the right. That is, back towards encouraging market mechanisms, and ultimately that trend led to the end of the Soviet Union. And in my last talk, which I gave to this group in March, I quoted Gorbachev's right-hand man for ideology, Alexander Yakovlev, who was in the Politburo. He was an extremely influential man. And it's very clear that he was a super right-wing anti-communist. He hated communism, socialism, Marxism. You have to ask yourself, how did a man like that get to be in the Politburo? How did somebody like Gorbachev get to be the leader of the party? Clearly, he was he believed in those kinds of things too. He was a super right-wing anti-communist. These people were leading the Moscow-led world communist movement. So there was a very sharp turn to the right after Stalin's death. And I think that we need to study that process and understand it so that we don't make the same mistakes again.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now, get the new people to get a chance first. Gene, I'll come back to you a little bit later, although you're next in line. So Narayanan Patti, if I pronounce your name correctly, Narayanan Patti.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Grove. Thank you. I'm from India. I'm Narayanan. And when I read the Dimitrov diary, in that, specifically about the Pyatnitsky, Stalin says something, important points. I have sent an email to Professor Dover, and he kindly gave me a reply. I want to point out that point in this discussion, because in 7th November 1937, emphatically, Stalin says that Pyatnitsky is a Trotsky. Moreover, in 24th April 1934, 3 years before, Stalin says Pyatnitsky is a quite narrow person. And at that time, the four persons, the Kisinin, Narun, and Mandelsky, all were not labeled, and they have to prove their credentials by the approval from the general public. That's a criticism of Stalin in 1934. And Pyatnitsky was shot on October 13, 1938. My question to Professor Gore is, how far the other four that is Kusin, Klorin, Manelsky, and including Pyatnitsky, how far they were informed by Pyatnitsky. That means Kusin and Klorin and Manelsky. And the needle of suspicion moves to all the leaders of the all Comintern. And my fear is, I am afraid it is not against Pyatnitsky alone. I want to know Professor Gover's words of wisdom regarding this this doubt. Thank you.
Narayanan, I really don't understand your question, but I know that you sent me some quotations today or yesterday from Dimitrov's diary, where, you know, they're discussing Pyatnitsky. Sure. So the issue there, of course, is not what Stalin thought or Dimitrov thought, but, you know, were they correct? You know, was Pyatnitsky really framed by Stalin, or was he guilty? In 1955, Pyatnitsky's two sons, of course, now they're adults, right? Pyatnitsky's two sons were given parts of his NKVD investigation file and also copies of the rehabilitation report that when Pyatnitsky was rehabilitated. And they reprinted those, or one of his sons, Vladimir, reprinted them in his book. Of course, now we have many other documents thanks to Vladimir Bobrov's work in the archives. And it's clear that Pyatnitsky was guilty, and there was a real dangerous Comintern conspiracy. That's what our book is about. But Pyatnitsky's sons never believed that, of course. They rejected this. And most people in the mainstream, maybe almost everybody in the mainstream of the study of the Soviet history, reject this because Stalin has been so vilified for so many decades that they, you know, it's just considered taboo virtually to say that he was not, you know, not a tyrant, not a mass murderer, and so forth. That's really the best thing I can say.
Okay, so next person that I'll go to is Ryan. Ryan, please go ahead.
Hi, Grover. Great to hear you talk again. Thank you for sharing. I'm just curious if any Trotskyist intellectuals or researchers have tried to rebut your work or offer to debate or anything along those lines.
Well, I noticed a year or so ago that on WSWS, the World Socialist Website.org, I was called a pseudo researcher. For a few of you on this talk, you'll know that there's I've been debating a Trotskyist on email and copying many of you for some years now. So that's been a kind of, you know, to a limited audience, but yes, there's been a ferocious debate, if you want, in email. But no, in general, the Trotskyists are not interested in this kind of debate because they don't have any evidence. In fact, if you look on my webpage, you can see that Jean-Jacques Marie, who is a Trotskyist professor in France, he's about 84, 85 years old, and he's been around for a very long time. He's written a lot of books. Attacked me a few years ago in the pages of Historical Materialism, which is a British Marxist-oriented journal. And I wrote a response. If you can read my responses. My response is on my webpage, and you'll see that Marie is just ignorant. I mean, he's very good at making insulting remarks, but when it came to knowledge of Soviet history, he clearly doesn't know much. But, you know, if you know the answer already, that is to say, you know that Stalin was this really bad guy and Trotsky was always right, you know, why would you do any research? I mean, you already know the answer. So nevertheless, it's striking that Jean-Jacques Marie's ignorance of a number of important issues in Soviet history certainly hasn't kept up with research. I submitted my response to historical materialism, and they rejected it. Okay. Sebastian Budgen, who is also an editor at Verso, which is another pro-Trotsky, anti-Stalin publishing house, is also on the editorial board, evidently, of historical materialism, and he just rejected it out of hand. We're not going to publish this. So they don't want to debate, and I can see why, because they're not going to prevail.
Thank you.
Yeah. Somebody's got to call on people to raise hands, not me.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Jean is next. Please, Jean, go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Grover, for your talk. I am in awe of your research and the work you do, and of course, fully in agreement with that, except I will say in defense of some of my Trotskyist friends that we don't talk about Stalin with my Trotskyist friends, but we do other kinds of work, anti-police brutality, and things like that. So I just want to make that note. But I wanted to say, you know, I look at Stalin a little bit differently, but with the same conclusions that you do. Because when I look at Stalin, I see a man that more than any other individual is responsible for the defeat of Nazi imperialism and the preservation of socialism in the Soviet Union. And this is something that the entire world, I believe, is in Stalin's debt. We don't acknowledge it that much, but I think it is the case. And I think Winston Churchill, who's not a communist by any means, acknowledges when he said something about the Battle of Stalingrad, it was Volgograd when it was fought, but it was Stalingrad, that basically, you know, this was the bloodiest battle in human history. And basically Stalin just would not give up, and he gave the order, you know, not one step backwards. So Stalin was no wimp by any means. I mean, he was tough, and he had to be, because you don't beat Hitler by not being tough. So I just wanted to throw out those observations and see your reaction to your comments, if you care to. Thank you.
Yeah, well, okay, let me answer this. First of all, there's an enormous work that was published 2 years ago about the Soviet home front, essentially, and how it was organized during World War II. And it's extremely detailed. It's very, very heavily documented. It's in English. And, you know, it goes into all the difficulties and so forth. But the Soviets did and this was not just thanks to Stalin, of course. This was basically done by the Soviet government, and the Communist Party was in the leadership. So there was a tremendous effort. But about the war, well, I'm now awaiting volume 3 of Stephen Kotkin's projected 3-volume biography of Stalin. Now, a few years ago, I published a book called Stalin Waiting for the Truth, in which I analyzed Kotkin's second volume, which runs from 1928 to 1941, which is the 30s, which is when all of the horrors supposedly happened. And of course, Kotkin, who is the world's expert on Stalin, at least from the point of view of the anti-communists, never found a single misdeed or crime that Stalin committed. So it's full of lies. It's full of fake footnotes and stuff like that. So his last volume is going to be from 1941 to Stalin's death, perhaps beyond, perhaps to Khrushchev's speech. And it's going to contain the war years. So we're going to see what kind of stuff Kotkin is going to come up with, what sort of, anti-Stalin, anti-communist stuff he's been able to locate when he publishes that book. That book has been postponed several times. It's now scheduled for July 2025. We'll see. If it comes out then, I'm going to have to devote a year or so to studying it. Because Kotkin, who was at Princeton University for many years, as well as at the Hoover Institution, and I understand has recently resigned from Princeton so he could be full-time at the Hoover Institution, is the world's foremost expert on Stalin, the bourgeois world's foremost expert on Stalin. And he has connections everywhere. He knows all of the other anti-Stalin scholars. He has access to all of the archives. So therefore, as with in volume 2, the fact that he could not find a single genuine crime of Stalin is probably the best evidence we're ever going to have that there weren't any such crimes, because certainly he would have put in some real crimes if he had found any. I mean, he might have still made up, fabricated the many crimes that he does put in, but he certainly would have put in some real crimes if he had found any, and he didn't find any. So volume 3 is going to be interesting, and it's going to contain the war years. And I must say that in conclusion, I have a tough time with military history. It's a subspecialty that really requires specialization, because you can't settle just for what the generals have to say. You have to go into the much closer down to the ground with unit histories and stuff like that. It's an enormous job. So I don't attempt to do that. I'm curious to see what Kotkin makes of it. David Glantz, who is, of course, a pro-capitalist historian, has spent his life doing this. And he has, to my knowledge, so far, the best detailed histories of how the Soviets defeated the Germans.
If I could just add there,
Okay.
in terms of military history, there is one important thing: who won and who lost. And
Right.
Stalin won, Hitler lost,
Yep.
which is important. Thank you.
Okay.
Got it. Mhm.
Okay. Okay. So the next person is Ruslan Akbarzadeh. Please, Ruslan, go ahead. Unmute yourself, Ruslan.
There we go.
Hello, Mr. Furr. How are
Yes.
you?
How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
Good to see you.
Have a nice day. My question is, do you think Khrushchev was a Trotskyist? What do you think about the periods when Khrushchev was allegedly a Trotskyist? Do you think Khrushchev was always a Trotskyist, or was he a socialist who didn't have enough information? My question is that. Thank you very much.
I don't know. I think that the existing biographies of Khrushchev are basically celebrations of him. They were basically written with the cooperation of Khrushchev's descendants. And I think they cover up more than they reveal. So instead of speculating without a basis, I prefer to say, I don't know. It's hard to know where Khrushchev, exactly how he ended up the way he did. I'll say this, though. it has to be more than just Khrushchev. When Khrushchev gave that secret speech, nobody in the Central Committee opposed it, not only at the time, but afterwards, except, of course, for Stalin's right-hand men. So I think that when Stalin died, he was politically isolated. I think that the party leadership had already turned towards Khrushchev type policies, and it would be and this, of course, had to have happened when Stalin was still in the leadership. So I think that the origins of Soviet revisionism, that's the word that, it's often used as a shorthand for this process of moving steadily to the right. The origins of that revisionism have to be sought in whatever was going on during the Stalin period, because these people Khrushchev and his minions didn't appear out of nowhere. And that's a very important study, and it needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. So the next person is Ken MacLeod. If I pronounce your name incorrectly, forgive me. Ken, go ahead.
Thank you, Ken MacLeod. Grover, I have read your book once, and I will obviously read it more than once, like I've read most of the other books.
Which book is that? Which book?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, which book did you read? I didn't see it. You flashed it, but
Oh,
okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I've got almost all of your books, and what I find fascinating about it is that it fills in a gap in the idea, in the history of the conspiracy, if you like, because if the opposition bloc in the USSR came to power by whatever means, assassination, coup, invasion, whatever, they would have a huge problem of dealing with the Third International. And in this book, there is presented evidence, in your book, there is presented evidence of how they plan to deal with that. And they had sounded out various people. They had a plan to, reach out to people who'd been expelled from the communist parties, people who are around the communist parties, leftists of various kinds. And it is it is a realistic plan. But it also suggests, in some of the confessions and statements and accusations, that they reached out to people who are very surprising, like Harry Pollitt, like J.R. Campbell. I suppose some of you will know the name of J.R. Campbell, Johnny Campbell, a British communist who wrote one of the most famous popular defenses for a popular audience of the trials and of the conspiracy. And he, according to the confession in the book, in your book, was sounded out by Bukharin, I believe. And we do know from, although the exact reference I can't put my finger on right now, we do know that Ranjani Palni Dutt, the prominent British communist and Stalinist, in one of his memoirs, said that he had been sounded out by one or other of the opposition leaders, Radek or Bukharin, whatever. But this inevitably sort of raises further questions about what was going on in the communist movement, because, as you say, most of the communist movement accepted the secret speech. Many people like Dutt, for example, remained, I guess, loyal to Stalin's memory, but they accepted the whole Khrushchev thing. The other question that comes up is that there's mention in the rehabilitation documents about how people who were prominent in the socialist countries, i.e. the people's democracies.
That's 2 minutes.
Sorry.
That's 2 minutes. Go ahead, finish up.
Just one thing. Does this whole story continue into the period of the people's democracies and the, notorious, quote unquote, trials that took place in the people's democracies after World War II?
Well, you'd have to study them. They're, you know, like the anti-communist scholars do with and Trotskyists do with the Moscow trials and with the conspiracy, you know, people who were tried and imprisoned or executed in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. These are all just declared fabrications. So there were trials in, let's say, Czechoslovakia, the Slansky trial, you know, and they glibly said, well, these are all, you know, fabrications or frame ups. And I don't know, maybe they were, maybe the Czechoslovakian communists did frame these people. I don't know, but you'd have to study that, right? But you just have to start by getting the primary sources. You'd have to start by learning the Czech language and then getting the primary sources, if you could get them out of the Czech archives, if they have published them, if they have released them. This is what's going on in Russia. Somebody should do that. I certainly can't do it. I'm full-time researching the Soviet period, but sure, somebody should do that stuff. But I think there's a sort of broader point, which seems clear to me. I don't want to claim knowledge that I don't have, but it seems to me that the communist movements in the countries that were bordering on the Soviet Union after World War II, the countries that became part of the socialist bloc, communist parties in these countries were not large. They had been seriously depleted by violence during the fascist period. They did not have a large base among the working class, although maybe you know, they're probably uneven. It was probably uneven. I mean, I think in Czechoslovakia they did have pretty good base, but maybe that's wrong. Number one, and so they didn't have the wherewithal to make their own revolutions in a certain sense, like the Soviet, like had happened with the Bolsheviks. And the second thing is this: what the Soviets really wanted by the end of World War II, is they wanted to be surrounded by friendly states. And the only way, they found out that the only way that they could be surrounded by states that were not hostile to them was if the governments had a strong participation in them of people from the communist parties, which were, of course, pro-Soviet. Because there were almost no non-communist politicians and political parties in any of these countries that were willing to have friendly relations with the Soviet Union. But don't forget, the Soviet Union, up until World War II, had no allies. It was surrounded by extremely hostile states. And so Soviets did not want, they wanted security above everything else. I don't think, but again, I'd have to study this. I don't think that they had, that the first thing that they were interested in was building socialism in the Eastern European countries. Their first priority was security, was having pro-Soviet governments. They managed to have pro-Soviet governments in Finland without, you know, conquering Finland. They defeated the Finnish army and put a few of its leaders on trial, but they had friendly relations with Finland, and they were not interested. They were not interested in trying to, you know, have a revolution in Finland or trying to force socialism onto Finland. I don't think that that's what they were primarily interested in doing. That's what the local communist parties wanted, but they were not primarily interested in that. But just to revert to your question, to understand what's going on in those countries, you'd have to learn the languages and get into the archives. That's what you'd have to do. I certainly can't do that, but somebody should do it.
Okay, so next person is Gavin. One other thing before Gavin goes, please only ask one question, not multiple questions, because we'll go into the second round for your follow-up questions. Gavin, please go ahead and keep your time to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Furr. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm a young guy. I'm in my teenage years, and there's a thing in America or in my state called National History Day.
Hmm.
You make a project and you go to some judges. And last year I did mine on the Soviet Nazi Pact, and I usually used your work, Blood Lies, for that research.
Mhm.
And one of the judges told me to use Bloodlands as a rebuttal to what I did. And that raised a question. So I got your book, The Katyn Massacre, some time ago.
Yep.
And I did the same thing, that I searched for critiques and what other people thought of it, which was not good intellectually, but I was kind of curious. So I searched up Sergei Romanov's critique of the book, and I was wondering what your opinions on Sergei Romanov was and if you would respond to them. I think I wrote you an email about this some time ago, but I'm not sure. That's it.
Did I answer you?
Hmm?
Did I answer your email?
I'm not sure if I sent an email or not. That's the thing.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That's it.
In my view, there has been no competent response to my research. Now, the problem with Sergei Romanov, who certainly is a smart guy, is that he's not looking for the truth. He's for decades been committed to the Polish position. Polish nationalist position is that the Soviets killed all these people. So he's not looking for the truth. So but let me just cut to the chase, okay? Because we don't have time to go into detail in Romanov's reply. The bottom line is this. If the Polish position, if the anti-communist position that the Soviets shot all these Polish prisoners of war is true, then there would be 6,000 plus prisoners buried at Miednia near Tver. There'd be approximately the same number outside of Kharkov in a place called Pyatnitsky, and there'd be in those two places. Okay, let's leave Katyn aside because that's been dug up several times. And there's been an attempt to find those bodies, and nobody's ever found them. If in the future somebody, some Russian government, whatever, goes into Miednia, where there's supposed to be 6,500 or something Polish prisoners of war dead and they're buried, if they find those bodies there, then I think I think that the Soviets' guilt would be proven. Despite all the arguments that I make in that book, the fact of the matter is that they've never been found, and they've looked. There have been several attempts to find those bodies. Romanov avoids that issue, which you have to do because, hey, where are the bodies? So I don't. I think that his is the most extended attempt to critique or disprove my research. I don't think anybody else has made even a half-hearted attempt.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, so one more request is that please ask question only relevant to Soviet era history, which Professor Furr has researched. Yep. And keep one question. Janet Coburn, you're next, please.
Thank you. Hi, Grover. So glad to see you today. If I may, I have two questions, one easy, real short, and the other not so much, and I'll take less than 2 minutes. My first question regards the documents released from Soviet archives you refer to. I may have missed it, but would you tell us who specifically released them and where in Russia are these archives located? My second question is hypothetical. And I understand you may not have a response, but here it is. If Stalin had lived to this day, and or if his successors had continued in the direction he was taking the Soviet Union, and assuming there was no collapse and the Soviet Union still existed today, and if there was no intervention from the West, what do you think life in such a hypothetical Soviet Union would look like today?
Actually, that's an easy question.
Oh.
Stalin did live. He lived until 1953. And virtually immediately, the Soviet leadership decided to turn to the right. That process must have been going on for some time during Stalin's lifetime, during the period of Stalin's leadership. So the roots of Soviet revisionism, of the Soviet Union, the turn towards capitalism, the ultimate collapse of the USSR in 1991, have to be at least in the Stalin period. We have to study the Stalin period in order to see how, where the Khrushchevs and the other leaders who did that came from. Where did they come from? Where did Alexander Yakovlev, who was a, sort of to the right, a super anti-communist right-winger, how did he manage to get into the Politburo? How did Gorbachev, who didn't have a clue about what Marxism was like, and of course didn't believe in any of it, how did he become the head of the party? You can see that the rottenness was very profound. So the roots of that have to be sought in the Stalin period, and you could go back to Stalin tried to implement what he believed that Lenin would have implemented, would have done. I think that's where the root of the problem lies. Now, your first question was,
where?
Opening the archive. The archive. Here's a story. The archives are. So Vladimir goes to the NKVD archive. Okay, he's been doing this for years now, so they know him. And they'll release to him. You shouldn't imagine these things are well organized. They're not like an open shelf library, where you can walk around. You go in and he goes in. Of course, he now for years, he and his associate, to whom he dedicates the book, our book. They know these people, and that's very important. And they're Russians, and that's very important. And they don't know what's available. They ask the librarians, and if you have a good relationship with the librarians, they'll bring stuff out to you.
Is it in Moscow or?
Moscow. Well, in this particular, the NKVD archive in Moscow. Although they're NKVD archive, there are archives in every city. Okay, so that's what. So it's not when they say they're open. That's what we mean. That's the process. It's not like, it's not like they're open in the sense of a regular library full of books is open. It's difficult. If I went to Moscow, I couldn't do that because they wouldn't trust me. They wouldn't know me. They'd say, "Oh, we'll look around, call us back in 2 weeks." And meanwhile, I'm going to be sitting there, doing what for 2 weeks. And then they'll say, "Well, we don't have anything." That's no good. I'm a foreigner. Okay. So, but certain materials are classified, and then the archivists will come back to Vladimir and his friend, and they'll say, "I'm sorry, we can't show you that. That's on the schedule for declassification in 2026 or 2027, or there is no schedule for that." But there's a lot of other stuff. But you don't know what's there, so you have to ask kind of at random. So it's not like, they're open, like a door is open, like a library is open. And a lot of other people are doing this stuff, and they publish, and other stuff gets published. And who knows why the stuff that gets published gets published? Who knows how that process proceeds? Because just materials come to light and get published, and you have to keep your eye on what's coming out. I'm working now on a huge database of investigative materials from the 1930s, which is online. And it's enormous. Somebody went to a tremendous amount of work to do this. And it's extremely revealing, but you know, there's no indication of just why these 500 documents or 600 documents or whatever they are were picked, as opposed to, you know, thousands of others that were not picked. So, you know, it's you know, we just have to deal with what we've got. But to say that the archives are open is somewhat misleading. It's a much more difficult process than that.
Okay, thank you. So Jake Fund is next, followed by Adam B.
Hi, Professor.
Jake,
Yeah, hi, Professor Furr. Real quick, thanks again. You spoke at our U.S. Friends of the Soviet People's Congress earlier this year. That
Sure.
was wonderful. Really appreciate that. I think my question is really based around, I'm reading this book called The Jews in the Soviet Union by Solomon M. Schwartz. And it's really just very anti-communist and basically talking about how, oh, the Jews of the Soviet Union have been oppressed from the Soviet Union, referring back to Stalin. But it does completely disregard Stalin's idea of the national question. Barabajan, it calls Barabajan a failure. And I guess that is, I mean, I would disagree with that. I saw it as something that actually spoke to the power of the socialist project of the Soviet Union. But what sources did you find on, you know, like these calls for cosmopolitanism that I think that I guess they accused the Soviet Union of doing? What sources could I look at? Because I know you had good stuff on this issue based around Stalin and Khrushchev lies. I think it was talking about like the doctor plot. But I was speaking more specifically about the Soviet Union's accusations to the Soviet Union of being quote unquote anti-Semitic.
Well, I do write about this somewhere. I think it was in Blood Lies.
I just thought that.
Of course, there's anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. There was anti-Semitism under the czars, and it didn't just magically vanish. And then a large part of the Soviet Union was occupied by the Nazis, and the Nazis did their best to spread anti-Semitism as much as they could and to infect the population with it. So of course there was anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. The real question is, was there state, you know, was the Soviet state pushing anti-Semitic policies? And there, you know, we get into this in our book, the death of Solomon Mikhoels, which we published last year in 2023. And it's clear that under Stalin, I mean, of course, they had to fabricate this idea that Stalin, you know, killed Solomon Mikhoels, that he had him murdered. And of course, that's not true at all. And then there's the issue of, you know, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which we don't really get into. But the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, you know, people were arrested in 1948 and 49, and they were tried in 1952. I got into that to some extent in that article that I published, well, a year and a half ago, on Paul Robeson Jr. and Paul Robeson. Okay. And it's on my webpage.
Okay.
Bonnie Weiss suggested that I should look at that because Paul Robeson Jr. said that, you know, his father overlooked the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. It's all I show there that that's just not true. The documents from the trial, the investigation and the trial of the Soviet the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee will not be declassified for some years in the future.
Oh.
If then, I mean, nobody's forcing the Russian government to declassify anything. But if and when they are declassified, I think they'll be very interesting. I'm sort of halfway hoping that Stephen Kotkin, who has all kinds of access that, I don't have, that somehow or other he's managed to get access to some of this stuff, this
Right.
post-war stuff.
Because
Don't
those
know if
are where a
that's
lot of the acquisitions come from, is from they say that the Jewish anti-fascists, what is it, that JF, whatever it was
Yeah.
called, that they were saying, oh, they were oppressing Soviet Jews. The Soviet Union was. That's what they're.
I say, take a look at that article. I think I have a section on that in there, but
Okay.
we don't have all of the information. And if you take a look at that, you'll see that it's a lot more complicated. That Solomon Schwartz, if he's the guy you're talking about,
Mhm.
was a famous member of the Jewish Bund and then a Menshevik, and of course was super anti-communist. And it's not as if he had access to primary source documents that we don't have, that somehow or other we don't have today,
Right.
You have to ask for evidence always. And anecdotal evidence, is not evidence. You ask somebody, well, what happened 40 years ago to you? There's no evidence. I have found no evidence that there was official government anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union during Stalin's time. I'm not saying there was after that either. I'm not denying it. I'm not asserting it because I haven't studied it. You have to study it. I don't think that forbidding people to go to Israel is anti-Semitic, for example, right?
Right.
But I haven't studied the post-Stalin period about that question, so I don't
Okay. No, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Adam B is next, followed by Anthony Gronovitz.
Yep.
Can you hear me okay?
Adam B is good. Yeah.
Is my sound working okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I could ask a lot of questions, but I'm going to do just one. Professor Furr, what's your understanding of how Pyatnitsky went from, who I understand to be a pretty old school Bolshevik, like siding against the Mensheviks in the early 1900s, going to jail, pretty committed revolutionary to get involved into these anti-party conspiracies all these years later? What was his?
Well, I answered that question. Let me just remind you of what I answered to when Janet Coburn, I think it was Janet, somebody asked her a little bit earlier. The disagreements during the 1920s about, since there were no revolutions in advanced capitalist countries. The disagreements about what the future path of the Soviet Union should be were intense. The people involved, and we're talking about the top party, top leadership, who are all old Bolsheviks and dedicated revolutionaries. Dedicated to overthrowing the Tsar, dedicated to overthrowing capitalism. But then what? The disagreements were very sharp because everybody thought that there was an enormous amount at stake, and the people who lost, many of whom became people who were in the opposition, many of whom stayed in the opposition. People who lost thought that this was a world shaking defeat. That is to say that if their policies weren't adopted, Stalin's policies were adopted, the policies associated with Stalin and his supporters were adopted, this would be catastrophic for the world communist movement and catastrophic for Soviet Russia. Well, if you think that the whole future of Soviet Russia and the world communist movement depends upon getting rid of Stalin and reversing the positions, the policies associated with him, then their dedication to underground organization, assassination, so forth and so on, become more understandable. Okay, they weren't sitting back having a philosophical discussion about these things. I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying, because they were all supposed to follow the party line, and they obviously didn't do that. They were supposed to follow Lenin, and Lenin was the one who proposed in 1921 the party rule that there should be no factionalism. and they formed factions. But they thought that the future of the world depended on it. Now, you know, I'm not saying that none of them were, you know, had personal motives, were maybe corrupt in some way or other, wanted to be leaders, were power hungry. I mean, those kinds of motives, I would say, are almost universal in everybody, and to one extent or another. Maybe to a minor extent in a lot of people, maybe to a large extent in other people. I'm not saying that. Okay, that's all true, but I don't think that explains it. I think that's secondary, in my opinion. I think that what explains it is these people thought the future of the world was at stake. And if you think the future of the world is at stake, you act in a very serious manner. Now, in my talk, I quoted Ivan N. Smirnov, his letter the day before he was executed to his daughter. It implies that he didn't know that Trotsky was collaborating with the Nazis. Didn't say that. He says, you know, you have to believe me that these people were really Nazis, that Trotsky's movement has been infiltrated by the Nazis. I mean, he's also saying that he didn't know about that, or he wouldn't use that language. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if he knew about it. But clearly, they took it so seriously that there were no holds barred. You know, they collaborate with the Germans, collaborate with the British and French, collaborate with the Japanese, assassinate Stalin. Anything goes if the future of the world communist movement is at stake. I think that's what was going on. That explains the determination and the dedication, and also the extent of the duplicity and the dishonesty of the opposition.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, Anthony, please go ahead.
Yeah, in a way, this segues to my question. The Soviet Union during World War II under Stalin's leadership had just enough troops to defend Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and Khrushchev was in charge of the Kiev defense. And Stalin decided that Moscow and Leningrad would come first and second in defense, and Khrushchev's defense of Kiev would be sacrificed. But Khrushchev abandoned Kiev. And so there was bitterness immediately afterwards between Khrushchev and Stalin. Do you think that contributed to Khrushchev's ascendance, along with other factors, that led to the 1956 speech?
Khrushchev was appointed to the Politburo in January 1938, long before the war. As for what happened, as for the details that you're talking about, I've heard them. I have not studied that. I have not gone out and seen, you know, where these stories come from, what the evidence is. So I don't want to say anything about that, because I haven't systematically studied it, and I don't feel competent to reply to have an opinion. I talked about that in my talk, that you have to doubt your own preconceived ideas, and you should base your views on solid primary source evidence. And I think it's very important, what I didn't say, but I'll say it now, I think it's very important for historians and for all of us to get used to saying the words, I don't know. If you don't have the evidence, let's not bullshit, or let's keep it to a minimum and just say, I don't know. So the answer to your question, Tony, is I don't know. I'm sorry, but I don't, and I don't want to speculate.
Well, I was relying on Ian Gray's biography of Stalin and Russia at War of Alexander Worth. I believe they both made that point.
Yes, I know, but I haven't studied I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm also not saying you're right, because I haven't studied that. I have studied so many events, so many allegations of crimes against Stalin, but of course the same method happened. It's good for anybody else. And from the primary sources, and seen that according to the primary source evidence of people who've written about that question and were were wrong, the primary source evidence overturns the general understanding that it's important for me to say about topics like this. I haven't researched it, therefore I don't know.
Okay, so next person in line is Heinrich Bücher. I hope I pronounced your name right.
Yes, great. Yeah, first, thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Furr. Very much appreciated. I would like to know what you think about Trotskyites and their influence, especially on the Palestinian protest movement. Because here in Germany, there are many groups supporting Trotskyites. One of them is the Marxist-Leninist Party in Germany, which is even a little bit stronger than the opposition party, the German Communist Party, which is pro-Russian. My name is Heinrich. I run the anti-war cafe here in downtown Berlin since 2005. We are pro-Russian, pro-Chinese, pro-BRICS, pro-Palestinian. And the group I cooperate with is organizing a campaign called Frente Unida America Latina in front of the US Embassy since 5 years. And so I would like to ask you about this question with the Latin Palestinian protest movement and the influence the Trotskyites have in that movement.
Well, the answer is I have no clue what's going on in Germany.
No, I mean internationally.
Yeah, internationally either. Are you familiar with this book? I'm going to hold it up here. Can you see the title? It's in German. This is a book of mine that's been translated into German. Have you familiar with that book?
No, no.
Okay, it says Leo Trotsky's Kollaboration mit Deutschland und Japan. Okay, and it's published a few years ago, translated into German. So I don't know about what the Trotsky in other respects, but you should read that. I mean, it's, of course, I have 3 other books about Trotsky and his, his collaboration and conspiracies and lies and so forth and so on, but they're all in English. But this book is actually in German. So I recommend it to you. I think you might find it useful, and you could, tell other people about it, and it's accessible to them because it's in German. That's about the best I can do. I can't. Okay, and earlier in my talk, I don't know when you joined the talk, I said that the danger, the problem with Trotskyism is, they claim to be we're the good communists. And what do they mean by that? What they mean is they spread anti-Stalin lies everywhere. They do that here, and obviously they do it in Germany. The real question is, why are they Trotskyists? Because they believe Trotsky, they believe his accusations against Stalin and against the Stalin-era Soviet Union. And I have written 4 books now, this is just one of them, showing that Trotsky lied, and we can prove that he lied. Okay? He was somebody who should, you can't trust Trotsky. You can't trust a word the man wrote. Now, of course, he had a big conspiracy he had this underground conspiracy going on. If you're going to have a successful conspiracy, you have to lie. So he lied. He told Pyatnitsky, he says, don't believe what I write in the Bulletin of the Opposition, which was his journal, during the 30s when he was in exile. Don't believe what I write there. I can't write the truth there. But of course, he had a conspiracy going on, so he couldn't tell everybody about it. It's not a conspiracy if you tell everybody about it. It's a joke. So naturally, what he wrote during the 30s was not at all the truth, was not what he believed. Or the Dewey Commission hearings. He lied up one side and down the other to the Dewey Commission. I have that in some of my books too. I analyzed the Dewey Commission, and Trotsky lied to them. They would never have found him not guilty. The Dewey Commission found him not guilty. They would never have found him not guilty if those people, even though some of them were Trotskyists themselves, they would never have done that if they had known he was out lying to them. And so Trotsky was just a liar. And the Trotskyists spread anti-Stalin, anti-communist lies within the left movement. And that's what makes them so harmful. Okay, because people naively think that, oh yeah, the pro-capitalists, the people who support capitalism and who are openly, overtly pro-capitalist and anti-communist, sure, they'll lie. But, these people are the good communists. They are anti-Stalin. Anyway, the Trotskyists are very bad. And the name of this book again is Leo Trotsky's Kollaboration mit Deutschland und Japan. Trotsky's Verschwörungen der 30er Jahren, Band 2.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, so next person is Shuo Ma. Shuo, please go ahead.
Hello, just want to say I read this article or pamphlet called Stalin's Attempt at Democratization. I think it was really good. Really, my main question is, so after the Khrushchev quote unquote revelations, whatever, the secret speech, as you mentioned, Chinese and Albanian communists split with the Soviet Union, claiming that it had fully turned into a capitalist society. Do you think that the Soviet Union at this point was unrecoverable, or do you think it would still be possible for, let's say, Chinese or Albanian communists to kind of turn it back and fight against the right opposition, or do you think it would have been better to just, I think, give up and it was unrecoverable?
Well, I don't know. Well, look what happened to China and Albania. They ended up in more or less the same place that the Soviet Union did, right? So there has to be something pretty fundamental wrong with the international communist movement of the 20th century if even those forces who were, very critical of Khrushchev ultimately ended up reverting to capitalism too, just like the Soviet Union. So I guess that's my answer to your question. But let me ask you something. Did you read that article of mine in English or in Chinese?
I read it in English.
There is a Chinese translation. Somebody sent it to me not too long ago. I don't know how good it is, but if you want it, send me an email. Give me your email, and I'll send it to you.
That's very interesting. My Chinese isn't good enough to really debate
to
read politics, but I have like an audiobook channel that I used to do, so I read it in English for that.
Sure. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So the next person in line is Rahman Wahabzada.
Oh, hi, Grover. Hi, everyone. I'm from the Caucasia, Azerbaijan. Firstly, I want to ask the Grover, in Azerbaijan, the government and the education teach the children that the Soviet Union is bad, and the Azerbaijani legion, which is they were fascist, was good, and they fought for the Azerbaijani independence. And they telling that the Soviet Union, especially NKVD, killed the most precious men in the Azerbaijani history. So Grover, what do you think about that? How can I research about it? How can I research about should I research on the local archives, or should I go to the Moscow?
Well, what you have to do, this could be a big job. So but let's boil it down. What you need to do is to pick, let's say pick one figure, one Azerbaijani prominent person who was tried and executed under, during the Stalin period, let's say during the 1930s. And then you have to find out what evidence there was against him. Now, I don't know where you're going to find that. Maybe it's in Azerbaijan, which of course at that time was part of the Soviet Union. Maybe it's in Moscow. You would have to find it. And then you would have to hope that it's been declassified and that you can view it. So you need to look at the evidence. Keep in mind that from approximately the end of July 1937 to November 1938, Nikolai Yezhov was the commissar of the NKVD. And Nikolai Yezhov and his men murdered several 100,000 completely innocent Soviet citizens. And that's why after Yezhov quit or was forced to resign, whatever happened in November 1938, Lavrenti Beria became the commissar of the NKVD, and under Stalin, Beria and his men investigated what Yezhov had been doing. And at the end of January, they sent a very important report to Stalin that Yezhov had been committing mass murder. I wrote a book called Yezhov versus Stalin, where I go into all of this. So it is possible that some of these Azerbaijani people were murdered by Yezhov, like many other people were, and they were entirely innocent. That's a possibility. So what you have to do is to pick, let's say, one of these people, or maybe you could research 2 or 3 at the same time, and find the evidence that the NKVD had against them, if assuming they had some. What you should not rely on the rehabilitations in the Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev period, Khrushchev and Gorbachev periods, basically, because they are not reliable. Many of them are the ones that we have read are very dishonest. That's what you would have to do. Now, of course, that's not what the school system in Azerbaijan is doing. They're not doing that any place. Okay, the anti-communists are trying to make communism look bad. They're not looking for the truth. If you want to look for the truth, you have to find the evidence. So I would say, go to it. And anything you find, please tell me about it. I'd be very interested.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Mirza Abbas is next, but I want to point out it's 12:35. There are 3 more hands raised. Grover, can you afford to spend a few more times, or should
Yeah,
we
I can
close the
spend 3
program?
more questions is good, and then I got to go deal with Susanna, who's in the hospital.
Okay. The last 3 questions: Mirza Abbas, Norma Harrison, and Enes. So Enes would be the last one. Go ahead. So it would be Mirza Abbas would be next. Okay.
Right.
I don't see
Hello,
Mirza
Professor
Abbas.
Furr.
Yeah,
Hi.
okay, there you are.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Hi.
All right. Hello, Professor Furr. I am a young Marxist-Leninist based in Pakistan, and I wish to better understand the various strains of revisionist ideology.
Yeah.
My question is, based on your research of the Trotskyite opposition within the USSR, how would you generally characterize Trotskyite ideology? Is it more of a cult? Are there ideological threads other than anti-communism which run through these different movements? What is the general understanding of Trotskyism?
Trotskyism is parasitic on, I think I said this in my talk, Trotskyism is parasitic on overt pro-capitalist anti-communism. That is to say, the Trotskyists simply repeat whatever the pro-capitalist, anti-communist liars have to say. They just repeat it uncritically. They don't even bother to look at the evidence. You know, as long as it says Stalin is bad, that's what they do. So Trotskyism is rotten at the root. Okay, they believe uncritically what Trotsky said, and in my books, I have researched that and subject, and Trotsky lied to an almost unbelievable degree. You read the research I've done, and you'll see. And the Trotskyists believe him. So that's why I say it's a cult, like the cult around Jesus Christ. You know, that's what it is. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't participate in, you know, strikes or that doesn't mean that none of them ever do anything that from a reform view basis that's good. But they spread anti-communism within the left movement, within the communist movement. And so they're very harmful in many respects. And in this respect, at least, they are more harmful than the overtly anti-communist writers, because the people who argue that capitalism is wonderful, you know, it's not too hard to see, not too hard for people on the left to see through that. Okay, but the Trotskyists claim that they're the real communists, but in fact they repeat these lies about that Trotsky spread uncritically, and repeat uncritically the lies of the overt anti-communist writers. So I think that's the response. And the books that I've written about Trotskyism, where I've investigated what Trotsky had to say, what Trotsky did. If you email me, I could give you a list, but you could probably find them on your own. I think that's very important. It's very important to document the fact that Trotsky was a very bad guy. Let me put it this way. Let me try to put it sharply. Trotsky started off his life as a communist, as a socialist, and then he became a communist. Trotsky ended up his life as a fascist, because he allied against the Soviet Union with the Nazis and the Japanese, plotted assassinations of Soviet leaders, conspired with his followers and with Nazis and nationalists in the Soviet Union to sabotage the Soviet economy, plotted with the Tukhachevsky affair, defendants, the leaders of the some of the leaders of the Red Army, to open the, to sabotage the Red Army, to open the borders in the case of a fascist invasion. We would call anybody who did those things, and he of course allied with open fascists. That's very clear in the first Moscow trial. That's why I started out my talk with quoting from Smirnov, who states that. And he was the leader of the Trotskyists in the Soviet Union. The Trotsky ended up his life as a fascist. And people need to understand that. And there's plenty of evidence for it. And that's why I wrote these books. So that's what you should study. And then you should, make up some agitational materials and expose them. That's what you need to do.
Okay, thank you. Norma, you're next.
Hi. I posted a note on the chat saying what we need to know, that we need to know what Putin has been researching. There's a strong tone of alliance to the revolution, etc., by the population, the Russians. And somebody posted back, Putin was involved in the coup to overthrow the Soviet Union. And that's my question, was he? And then she wrote, Putin is all down with the CBDC, and I don't know what the CBDC is.
Norma, I'm going to be brief. I know a little bit about Putin, but not enough to answer your question.
Okay.
Never done research on his.
Okay.
Never done research on him.
Okay, maybe somebody else will write me a note in the chat.
Sure.
Okay, so next and the last person is Enes. Enes, please go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Furr. My name is Enes. My question is specifically, how do you evaluate Trotsky's rule during the Russian Civil War? Were his military strategies successful or did he make strain mistakes?
Could you, first of all, Mr. Ennis, what country are you speaking from?
I am from Turkey.
Okay, very good. Well, secondly, could you restate your question? I have to say, I really didn't understand it.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, repeat your question. What was your question?
Okay. Were his military strategies successful or did he make strike?
The Civil War?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. The Civil War is not sufficiently researched. There is some research about it. It's very difficult to research it because, like I said earlier, researching wars is very difficult. You really need to get way beyond what the commanders and the politicians had to say or what they wrote, and get down to the day-to-day individual unit level to find out what was going on. And that can be very difficult. It can be extremely time consuming. Sometimes these records are not even available. The only scholar that I'm aware of, now I've never specialized in military history, but the only scholar I'm aware of who's made some sort of attempt to do that is David Glantz, but he writes about World War II. So I do not feel that I am in a position to make any judgment about the tactical leadership of any of the commanders during the Civil War period. Trotsky, of course, was not really a commander. He was in charge of the army. He was the commissar. So he wasn't in a day-to-day command position of any particular unit of troops. He made certain strategic decisions, but he wasn't down on the ground in the battle, so to speak. Stalin was here and there, and of course many others. Not only have I not researched the Civil War in the detail that it would need to be done, but I don't know anybody who has done that. I'm not saying nobody has, but I've never concentrated on that. I try to stay away from military history because it's so difficult, and it's not clear to me what's at stake. Because let's say, General X made a bad decision. Well, everybody makes bad decisions. Or Trotsky made a good decision. Well, unless you're completely incompetent, you'll make some good decisions too. So I'm not real sure what is at stake here in a detailed study of the Civil War. I'm not saying I just don't know. So I can't. I have to tell you, in case of your question, I just don't know. I'm sorry, but I haven't researched it, and I don't know. But thank you for the question, and thank you for listening. Yes, and thank you all for attending my talk. Been very generous with your time. I appreciate your questions. Thanks to the ICSS, my ICSS comrades who have invited me to talk many times, and this time too. And I hope, working on some more research, I hope that in a year or so, we can all do this again. Thank you.
Best thoughts about your wife.
Thanks, Grover.
Yes, I'm going to go see her now.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna.
Thank you very much. All right, bye-bye.
Send her our best regards.
UC
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.